Did you know? In the first draft of Mewtwo Strikes Back, Mew could talk, and it was actually kind of a jerk. In one of his Japanese blog posts we translated, the movie's head writer Takeshi Shudo said, "There were lots of points where Mew told Mewtwo, 'After all, you're nothing but a copy.' This triggered Mewtwo's inferiority complex and a burning hatred towards the original Pokémon. These lines were meant to needle at Mewtwo and defend its ego. It was like a drama where they debated Mewtwo's right to exist. Mew's personality is violent and unpredictable, and yet it looks innocent, cute somehow, and doesn't appear to be threatening. So in a way, it's both cruel and effective for Mew to incessantly chip away at Mewtwo's self-esteem." Shudo goes on to say they had a hard time making Mew's voice sound both innocent and offensive, so they just changed it so Mew just flies around looking cute saying its own name. But even though it can't talk in the final script, it's still just as much of a jerk. Shudo made that clear on his personal blog saying, "I don't think Mew's lines in the first draft were wasted. What Mew wanted to say was a copy's just a copy. I can't tolerate the existence of copies made by humans. Both Mew and Mewtwo feel anger towards humans for creating a connection between them without their consent. I think that first draft was necessary to make sure the director and staff understood both Pokémon's motivations. So, if you've been thinking of Mew as sweet and innocent, you thought wrong. That's just its soft exterior hiding a, quote, cruel, violent, and unpredictable personality." In another blog entry we translated, Shudo says the first Pokémon movie was originally planned as a follow-up to an anime episode he planned to write himself that would have established Mewtwo's backstory and a confrontation against Ash. That's why the movie's called Mewtwo Strikes Back. It's a revenge story for what happened in the TV show. That said, they actually came up with the name of the film before anything else. Shudo said, "According to the Japanese TV schedule, Mewtwo is supposed to have already appeared on TV by the time the film releases. He's supposed to have faced off with the anime protagonist once already. Maybe the protagonist even beat Mewtwo somehow. So let's make it a story about Mewtwo's revenge." One of the Star Wars movies was called The Empire Strikes Back, which Shudo thought sounded cool. So that's what they titled the first Pokémon movie. Pre-production was getting started, but soon after, a Porygon episode with flashing lights gave thousands of Japanese kids seizures in an incident now known as the Pokémon Shock. Due to health concerns, the Pokémon anime got pulled off Japanese TV for 4 months, and by the time it returned to the airwaves, the writers' initial plans were so far behind schedule that the episode with Mewtwo's backstory never got made. To be clear, Mewtwo did appear in a few episodes that aired a few months after the movie came out, but these were not the episodes Shudo originally intended. That one never even got written, and the reason Mewtwo is striking back was changed from getting revenge on Ash to getting revenge on Mewtwo's creators.
私は私を生んだ全てを恨む。だからこれは攻撃でもなく宣戦布告でもなく、私を生み出したお前たちへの逆襲だ。
When Shudo was still in the early stages of writing the movie, the higher-ups at the studio hired Masachika Ichimura to play the voice of Mewtwo. Ichimura was the actor who played the Phantom of the Opera in the Japanese theater production, and Shudo was starstruck and super excited to hear he'd signed on to the film. With that in mind, he wrote Mewtwo to basically be a Pokémon version of the Phantom, having a dark past that leads him to isolate himself from society. Controlling, secretive, intelligent, and seen by the outside world as scary and evil, even though in his heart of hearts he's really just tortured by his own existence, and overwhelming sense of solitude. Shudo even gave Mewtwo a castle to mirror the Phantom's opera house. As Ichimura was getting in character to voice Mewtwo, he turned to Shudo and asked, "Mewtwo's character is the Phantom of the Opera, right?" Shudo nodded and whispered, "You're exactly like the Phantom of the Opera." Most fans outside Japan have never heard Ichimura's performance as Mewtwo, although it's really quite good and you should definitely check it out, but him being cast had a profound and lasting influence on the series, not just in the movie, but how fans around the world perceive Mewtwo to this day. With nothing but his appearance in Gen 1 to base the character on, Shudo could have very easily written Mewtwo as a comic book supervillain, or a monster who couldn't even talk. But thanks to the Phantom of the Opera and how it inspired Shudo, Mewtwo will always be known as dark, brooding, and isolated.
私は誰だ。ここはどこなんだ。私は何のために生まれたんだ。
Speaking of Mewtwo's castle, in Mewtwo Strikes Back, it's in a movie-exclusive location called New Island, but where exactly that is in the Pokémon world is never explained. However, some Japanese books published a couple years later featured a map of the Orange Islands, which revealed New Island is actually southwest of Cinnabar. In 2020, a scientist named Yun Xiao discovered 3 new species of beetle in Australia. He named them Binburum articuno, Binburum moltris, and Binburum zapdos. We got in contact with Yun to ask about them, and he told us, "I always feel it's nice to connect popular culture to biotaxonomy to raise awareness for conservation of the amazing diversity of our Earth's ecosystem. And I really appreciate the biodiversity of the Pokemon world, which is actually based on real-world diversity. When we identified 3 new species at one time, an idea of 3 legendary Pokemon who always appear in each generation came to mind. And as my first contact with Pokemon, the first generation's the one that left the deepest impression. That's why I chose these 3 birds. I won't say playing Pokemon is the only thing that inspired me to become a biotaxonomist, but it must have had an influence." Apparently these beetles were sitting in a museum since the 90s unidentified until Yun discovered them. It's unknown where they were actually found in the wild, so it seems fitting that beetles named after legendary Pokemon are classified as habitat unknown. Their rarity was another reason Yun named them after the bird trio. He told us they're, quote, "as rare as legendary Pokemon." In fact, they're so rare that video of live specimens don't even exist. All there is this single photograph. We also want to point out that in red, blue, and green, all legendary birds had 8 toes, except Zapdos, who only had 6. But later on, it sprouted 2 more toes in a stealth update, making it equal with Articuno and Moltres. Speaking of early designs, the November 1996 issue of CoroCoro magazine was the first time Pokemon Blue was ever announced, and the magazine showed off some beta sprites that were planned to appear in blue, but ended up getting replaced at the last minute, including one for Mewtwo. We actually think it's a pretty big improvement over the Mewtwo sprite that did end up getting used, not only in Japanese blue, but the versions of red and blue that released internationally. This unused blue sprite for Mew was discovered in a 2019 leak of prototype assets, but a couple even more interesting sprites were discovered in leaks dating back to Gen 2's development, revealing a couple early designs for Celebi. The first is pretty clearly modeled after the Native American fertility god Kokopelli, who's known for being a bit of a trickster. With origins dating back over 1,000 years, Kokopelli presided over childbirth and agriculture, and also represented the spirit of music, and playing his flute was said to chase away winter and usher in spring. While a little less obvious, the later Celebi appears Kokopelli-inspired as well, and displays a strong Native American motif. Game Freak never commented on these leaked sprites, but fans have speculated the designs were scrapped possibly to avoid controversy. Kokopelli was primarily a god of the Hopi tribe, who still exists today but were mostly wiped out during colonization. And Game Freak might have realized that turning their god into a Pokemon wasn't the best idea. Or they may have simply decided to take Celebi in a different direction. Although they never talked about those beta sprites, Game Freak has talked a bit about Celebi's development. Junichi Masuda wrote on his blog that they decided it would have a nature theme. Not much else was officially explained until 2018, when an interview was posted on Game Freak's official YouTube channel. It's in Japanese, so we translated it into English. In the video, Hironobu Yoshida explains that he was a new Pokemon designer brought on for Gen 2, and his first task was creating Wobbuffet, Dunsparce, and Celebi. Presumably, Celebi's nature setting was part of the design specifications handed down to him. In the video, he says, "So when I got to work, I realized Celebi was at the bottom of the Pokédex list. I asked why that was, and they told me it was going to be a legendary Pokémon. It's the same as Mew. So I aimed to design a small, cute, fairy-like Pokémon like Mew. That's how Celebi came to be." Yoshida, Morimoto, and Uno go on to say that similar to the Mew under the truck rumors in Gen 1, after Gold and Silver launched, a new rumor started to spread, that Celebi could be found at the shrine in Ilex Forest. Shigeki Morimoto was the guy who added Mew into Gen 1, and he's known as a bit of a rascal. So everyone at Game Freak accused him of hiding Celebi at the shrine, saying, "You didn't add that in there, did you? What'd you do? What'd you do?" But Morimoto was innocent. It turned out the rumor was completely made up and they had no idea how it started. But then they thought, that's kind of interesting. So when they made Crystal a year later, they added an in-game event where you actually could catch Celebi at the Ilex Forest Shrine. So the mysterious fan rumor actually became a reality. It's at this point the interviewers realize the shrine literally had zero purpose in Gold and Silver, and ask, so why did it even exist? According to the developers, that's a question even they don't know the answer to, which just makes the Celebi rumor all the more mysterious.
じゃあその祠っていうのは何のためにあったんですか？
セレビーが出ると噂された祠は何のためにあったんですか？
イベントっていうのは
僕もちょっと調べたんですけど、
はい、
誰も覚えてないらしいんです。
なるほど。
それこそ謎。それはそれですごい。
祠についてわかる人は 誰もいなかったんですね。
Next up, we've got Ho-Oh. Did you ever wonder why it appeared in the first episode of the anime years before Gold and Silver even launched in Japan? According to Takeshi Shudo, it was just marketing. Simple as that. In a couple blog posts he wrote, "When I started writing the script, I was informed that the second generation of Pokemon games was nearing completion. Some felt that Ho-Oh should be shown as a draw for the whole series, if only for a few seconds, so the scene was added in." Over a year ago, we made a 20-minute video entirely dedicated to Lugia, where we talked about how Shudo created Lugia and before it had a proper name, and was simply referred to as Pokemon X. After the video was already published, our friend Aleph sent us this early concept art made by Ken Sugimori, revealing it literally had an X on its belly early in development, which was shown off at the Pokemon the Movie XY exhibit in Tokyo in 2014. In our Lugia video, we also talked about some connections Lugia has with Ryujin, the Japanese god of the sea. One of y'all in the comments pointed out one more connection that we missed. In Pokemon X and Y, there's a small cave where you can find the legendary bird trio. In the English version, this cave is called the Sea Spirit's Den, but in Japanese it's called Watatsumi's Den. Watatsumi is Ryujin. It's the same god, just by another name. The legendary bird found inside strengthens the cave's connection to Lugia, and also strengthens Lugia's connection to the Japanese god of the sea. And as we noted in our previous video, in the Japanese version of the second movie, Lugia is literally called, quote, the god of the sea. Now let's talk about the relationship between Ho-Oh and Lugia. You've probably already heard about their connection with the real-life temples in Japan. We already talked about that in a video about 6 years ago, so for today's video, we're just going to focus on all the opposing forces Ho-Oh and Lugia represent. In a 2009 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine we translated, all the top developers sat down for an 8-page interview promoting the release of Heart Gold and Soul Silver. The interviewer said, "This one's a deep question about the world. So Groudon and Kyogre represent land and sea, Dialga and Palkia are time and space, and it seems like every legendary Pokemon has an exact opposite. Are Ho-Oh and Lugia opposites?" They reply, "There's no direct relationship between Ho-Oh and Lugia in the story, but as far as their motifs, they represent the sun and the moon, or day and night. That's how I picture them. Like light and shadow, the sky and the bottom of the sea, above and below. That's their meaning. So basically, they're opposites in the sense that they represent day and night and the sky and the sea. That's pretty interesting in itself, but it's what they said next that piqued our interest. Kenji Matsushima, who was game designer on Gold and Silver and the remakes, said, "When Ho-Oh and Lugia first appeared on Game Boy, they had time-related abilities. That idea remains unchanged in Heart Gold and Soul Silver." So what's he mean by time-related abilities? After all, it's Celebi who's the time-traveling Pokemon, not Ho-Oh and Lugia. Ho-Oh can learn Sunny Day and Lugia can learn Rain Dance, but those are really more weather-related, so that's probably not what they're talking about. Looking through their Gen 2 learn sets, there are two other attacks that stand out, Future Sight and Ancient Power. It's worth noting that in Japanese, Ancient Power translates more closely to Primeval Power, meaning not just ancient, but even older, the earliest stages in the history of the world. Future Sight and Ancient Power were both added in Gen 2, as was the concept of time itself, with Gold and Silver introducing a real-time clock and day-night cycle. Even more interesting, Celebi also learns Future Sight and Ancient Power. And all three Pokemon with these time-related abilities are grouped at the end of the Pokédex together. Lugia representing night, Ho-Oh representing day, and Celebi representing time travel. So the argument could be made that together all three legendaries comprise a sort of time trio. Gen 3's Weather Trio, Gen 4's Creation Trio, and Gen 5's Tau Trio also have a pair that are more closely linked, and a third Pokemon that's a little more of its own thing. Time Trio isn't a term currently in use by the fandom, and it doesn't even have a Bulbapedia page. But it's worth noting that even though the Weather, Creation, and Tau Trio do have Bulbapedia pages, none of those terms are actually official. They were all created by fans to refer to groups of Pokemon, so in that regard, the concept of a time trio is just as official as all the rest of them. Which is to say, not at all, but a fun and potentially useful method of categorization. Speaking of fan-made terms, let's move on to the legendary beasts, which even though it's not an official term, you probably know exactly which Pokemon we're talking about. There's been a long-standing argument between fans about whether they're legendary dogs or legendary cats. Their early sprites from Gold and Silver's 1997 Space World demo leaked online in 2018, showing much more dog-like designs. But they underwent some drastic changes over the next 2 years of development, resulting in 3 Pokémon that are almost unrecognizable as the same species. In 2012, their designer Muneo Saito shed some light on the famous cat versus dog question. In a Twitter thread we translated, art director Ken Sugimori said, "Let's try asking Muneo Saito, do Raikou, Entei, and Suicune have any animals they're based on? Like people say they're based on dogs or something." Saito replied, "At the time, I already had kind of a vision in my head for Entei. I was rolling that vision around in my head for a while trying to figure out how to connect Suicune and Raikou's designs, but it wasn't really coming together. I'm a manga artist, so I tried approaching things from the perspective of character creation. I thought of the story behind the Pokémon and worked backwards from there to figure out what features they needed. So a king with a majestic mustache and a rock-like body covered in thick hair and volcanic smoke rising from behind its head, Entei's design was taking shape. It basically looked like a lion, but I didn't want it to look too much like any one animal. So I settled on a silhouette that could look like either a dog or a cat or neither. After that, I settled on tiger-like and leopard-like designs for Raikou and Suicune. Suicune came together easily, but Raikou's design took a lot of twists and turns to get right. There was even a Blue Thunder version with a drum on its back. So basically there are direct tiger and lion motifs, but the main idea is that they're designed to be spirits responsible for each element. Or rather, I aim to make them like distinguished gods. So there you go. They're based primarily on cats. Entei's a lion, Raikou's a tiger, and Suicune's a leopard. But Saito also said their silhouettes were made to look ambiguous, so there's still a little wiggle room for fans who don't want to believe they're cats. Although we should also note that 2022 is the year of the tiger in the Japanese zodiac, which is why Pokemon designers like Saya Saruta and Ken Sugimori tweeted out brand new Raikou artwork to celebrate New Year's. Because it's a tiger. Cats, guys. They're cats. We swear to God they're not dogs. In that thread, Muneo Saito also mentioned an earlier Raikou design, a Blue Thunder version with a drum on its back. Some YouTubers have claimed this Saito artwork is that early design, but that doesn't appear to be true. For one thing, there aren't any drums. Saito probably doesn't mean these kinds of drums, by the way. He's talking about the Japanese-style drums carried by Raijin, the Japanese god of thunder. And also, Saito responded to one of our tweets a few years ago, saying he actually made this artwork to promote a character design class he taught in 2014. This was the website that promoted his design class, and it also features Saito's artwork for a bipedal dragon, these jellyfish fruits, a popcorn family, and a psychedelic orchard. They're all interesting and possibly even inspired by unused concepts from his time working on Pokemon, but this doesn't appear to be the Blue Thunder Raikou he told Sugimori about. Blue Raikou's never been made public, not even in a leak, and doing so himself would put Saito in very, very hot water with Pokemon's legal team. So it seems fans will probably never get a chance to lay eyes on that long-lost legendary design. Moving on to Gen 3, you probably already know that Deoxys' design was inspired by DNA. In the Pokédex, it's even classified as the DNA Pokémon, but you might not have realized its 4 forms actually spell it out: the defense form, neutral form, attack form, and speed form. Together form an acronym for DNAs. In Gen 3, Deoxys can only be found on Birth Island, which is geographically isolated from other Sevi Islands. It's based on the real-life island of Minami Torishima, which is also geographically isolated, with the nearest Japanese island more than 700 miles away. A far-flung island with no inhabitants, it was claimed by the US government in 1889 because it was covered in guano, basically just poop, but valuable at the time for its use in fertilizers. The Japanese and American governments argued over who owned the tiny poop-covered islands for decades, especially when its location became militarily strategic, so America bombed the crap out of it in World War II. The US took control of Minami Torishima soon after, but eventually decided they didn't really care about it after all, and gave it back to Japan. In 2015, the now deserted island mysteriously vanished off satellite images, with the Japanese Coast Guard saying, quote, "There is a possibility that the islet has been eroded by wind and snow and as a result, disappeared." Conspiracy theories spread that a government cover-up was in the works, maybe centered around military technology, but the island quickly reappeared soon after, making headlines for an even bigger reason. Huge deposits of rare earth minerals were discovered in the island's mud, which could be enough to supply the world for centuries. There's a good chance that someday the screen on your smartphone will be made from minerals on Minami Torishima, not to mention key components in hybrid cars and missile systems. In other words, the real-life home of Deoxys is one of the most mysterious and important islands on the entire planet. Ever wonder why Latias and Latios are psychic and dragon types? In our Lugia Origins video, we heard Shigeki Morimoto's explanation for why Lugia is half psychic instead of half water. Basically because psychic Pokemon were super powerful back in the early generations, so it was made psychic flying not for design or lore reasons, but just to make it strong. In a 2018 interview, Morimoto explained that's essentially the same reason Latias and Latios aren't flying types, saying, "When we were deciding the types for them, we wanted to give them Psychic type and Dragon type to really express their strength. But once we did that, we looked at them and knew they needed to fly, but couldn't give them the Flying type too, so we ended up giving them the Levitate ability instead." Rayquaza's got a pink tongue in all its official artwork, but early sprites actually depicted with a blue tongue. The blue tongue can be seen clearly in all the Gen 3 games, Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, and even Gen 4's beta, but after Diamond and Pearl hit store shelves, Rayquaza's blue tongue was never seen again. Here's what that official artwork would look like if it kept that early coloration. Again, on the topic of its color, a special shiny Rayquaza was released exclusively in Japan, Nobunaga's Rayquaza. Pokémon Conquest was a tactical RPG spin-off released in 2012, with the feudal warlord Nobunaga essentially acting as the game's villain as he seeks to conquer the Ransei region by force. In the last mission, he calls upon Black Rayquaza to serve as the game's final boss. To promote Pokémon Conquest's release in Japan, a Black Rayquaza with its original trainer identified as the warlord Nobunaga was distributed over Wi-Fi, but only to Japanese copies of Black and White. We don't have much to say about Gen 3's other legendaries that hasn't been said before, so let's go ahead and move on to the generation most focused on its legendaries. According to the game's director Junichi Masuda, "I decided that Ultimate was the theme in the beginning of Gen 4's development. The key element was to create the storyline around the Pokémon in Sinnoh mythology. The relationship between all these Pokémon is the key element. I wanted to express the importance of the balance between substance, Dialga, the ruler of time, and Palkia, the ruler of space, and spirit, Uxie, Mesprit, Azelf. If the substance becomes too large, the balance of the spirit collapses. I wanted Dialga and Palkia to become counterparts for a sense of balance. Infinite time and infinite space. That to me is the ultimate." In another issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, art director Ken Sugimori explains that Dialga and Palkia were created based on instructions from Masuda, and they went out of their way to make dragons that, unlike earlier designs like Dragonite, Salamence, and even Charizard, were a drastic departure from the conventional look of fantasy world dragons, which is why they don't look anything like the scaly lizards you'd see in Western or even Eastern mythology. To make Giratina's origin form and the distortion world, the developers borrowed a concept from Japanese culture. After directing Diamond and Pearl as the ultimate Pokémon games, Masuda felt they had to go even bigger for Platinum, so he instructed Platinum's director Takeshi Kawachimaru to use antimatter, and Sakasa Fuji as inspiration to create the distortion world. Sakasa Fuji translates to reversed Mount Fuji, and it's the concept of a reversed Mount Fuji, the reflection in the lake underneath, a distorted reflection of reality. Trying to explain it, Masuda said, "It exists, but it actually doesn't. It doesn't exist, but it does." That sort of thing. The mountain exists on the lake through human eyes, but it's only a reflection and doesn't exist. It's a diverse world. You see it only because you're looking at it with your own eyes. When designing Giratina's origin form, we paid meticulous attention to the character's details. Our designer redrew Giratina's image again and again to make it a Pokémon from the antimatter world. When Pokémon Legends Arceus released, fans were perplexed at the new origin forms for Dialga and Palkia, but they finally made sense when Japanese fans realized if you combine them with origin form Giratina, all three fit together to make Arceus. There's actually some lore about their origin forms that wasn't included in the game itself, but was published on the game's official website. For Palkia, it says, "They say that the very space in the world where origin form Palkia resides is in shreds, as if it had been torn to ribbons. And for Dialga, the flow of time is said to be in constant flux in the world where origin form Dialga resides, always moving in different directions and different speeds." Dialga also got a unique form never included in the mainline series, Primal Dialga, who only appeared in Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky. In an alternate future timeline, the time gears are stolen from Dialga's home, the Temporal Tower, which strips Dialga of its powers of time control, along with its ability to express logic, reason, and even mercy. In other words, it's not as powerful as normal Dialga, but it makes up for it with mindless villainy, driven only by its primal instinct. Besides its unique lore attributes, it also differs in color. Primal Dialga was also the antagonist in the Blazing Exploration Team manga and made a brief appearance in the Beyond Time and Darkness anime special. But since he's only been seen in the PMD side series and not in over a decade, he's probably not considered canon to the mainline franchise. And since we're already on the topic of non-canon legendary forms, let's wrap up with a couple more from the series' history. First announced in a 2015 teaser trailer, Shadow Mewtwo was designed first and foremost by Bandai Namco, the developers of Pokken Tournament, but Game Freak and the Pokémon Company contributed as well. After a plot device called the Shadow Synergy Stone merges with and corrupts Mewtwo, it becomes Shadow Mewtwo, and flies around the Farum region draining Gaia to become even more powerful. Also, it can essentially Mega Evolve into its Mega X form, although the game doesn't call it that. According to Pokken's producer Masaaki Hoshino, when we were originally coming up with the design, we worked very closely with the Pokémon Company and Game Freak to make sure everything was right. What happened was we at Bandai Namco had the idea of making a really cool dark-colored Mewtwo, so we had one of our designers take a crack at it and then presented that to the Pokémon Company and Game Freak. They all thought it looked really cool, so then we worked together to brush it up. Because everyone really liked Shadow Mewtwo, I have a personal hope Game Freak will continue to use it, but it's not really our decision, unfortunately. Sadly for those designers, Shadow Mewtwo never appeared in any other games after Pokken Tournament, and when Polygon asked the Pokémon Company in 2016 if Shadow Mewtwo was canon or not, they were met with a very non-committal reply, no comment. An even lesser-known variant is Fragment Mew. It was created by famous Japanese designer and musician Hiroshi Fujiwara in a partnership with the Pokémon Company they called the Thunderbolt Project. Fujiwara is famous for making streetwear fashion, so his Mew design was plastered on shirts, hoodies, hats, and turned into plushies. Even Mew's original creator Shigeki Morimoto was a fan, and appeared on Game Freak's official Japanese YouTube channel wearing a Fragment Mew t-shirt. That was actually the episode where Morimoto explained how he made Mew back in the 90s. Fragment Mew's official artwork was never released digitally, so we commissioned artist Rachel Briggs to trace the hoodie design for use in this video, and we'll post it on Twitter for folks who want to use it. Mew was kind of the project's mascot and got the most unique artwork, but a few other Pokemon appeared on Thunderbolt merchandise too, like Mewtwo, the Kanto starters, and Pikachu. You could say Thunderbolt Pokemon are sort of their own special variants, kinda like Shadow Pokemon. But even though they're officially licensed Pokemon products, they probably can't be considered canon, although there's certainly an interesting footnote in Pokemon history. Unfortunately, they're also incredibly rare pieces of history. A lot of them were sold at limited-time pop-up shops in places like Japan and New York, so if you want to get your hands on one nowadays, you'll probably have to fight like a wild dog for it on eBay. Well, we're already about 30 minutes into this video and we haven't even gotten halfway through the series, so we'll cover legendary Pokemon from Gen 5 onward in a future video. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. If you're looking for more Pokemon videos to watch right now, click the video on screen for a whole hour of Pokemon facts. Special thanks to translators, the folks who helped us find these old Japanese magazines, and our proofreaders. Thanks for watching!